He pulled my chair out from under me at Christmas dinner and said that seat was for his real daughter. No one stood up. Not my cousins, not my aunts, not even my mother. I hit the floor and realized something terrifying. They weren't shocked. They were used to it. My name is Elena Whitmore. I work in compliance, and that night, while everyone else chose silence, I chose documentation. 3 months later, the same man who told me to get out was removed from his own company by a court-approved agreement. But none of that started in a courtroom. It started with a family that thought I would stay quiet. Chapter 1. The Seat Everyone Let Me Lose. I still remember the way the house looked that night. Warm lights spilling from every window, the same wreath on the door my mother had hung every December since I was a teenager. December 2024 had been busy and loud everywhere else, but that house in suburban Dayton, Ohio, felt like it always had, familiar, safe, or at least it was supposed to. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon candles hit me the moment I stepped inside. Coats were draped over chairs, shoes lined up by the wall, laughter floated in from the dining room, the kind that comes from old jokes repeated so many times they stop being funny, but everyone laughs anyway. It was the sound of a family performing itself. I greeted a few relatives, nodded at people I had known my entire life, and made my way to the dining table. I took the seat I always took. It was not special. It was not at the head of the table or anywhere important. It was simply the place where I had sat every holiday for as long as I could remember. It felt automatic, like muscle memory. For a few minutes, everything stayed normal. Plates were passed around. Someone asked about work. Someone else complained about the weather. I answered politely, keeping my voice even, smiling when it was expected. I had learned how to do that years ago. Mark Harlan arrived late, as usual. He always did. He liked making an entrance, liked the way conversations paused when he walked in. At 58, he still carried himself like the most important man in the room, confident, loud, comfortable. He kissed my mother on the cheek, accepted a drink from someone nearby, and scanned the table. Lily arrived a few minutes after him, apologizing dramatically for traffic, though everyone knew she lived 10 minutes away. Her arrival drew immediate attention. Chairs shifted to make space, compliments were offered, someone poured her a drink before she even sat down. Mark looked at me then, and for a second his expression was almost amused. He made a comment, light enough to sound like a joke, about how that seat was for family. The words landed softly, but the meaning did not. I did not move right away, not because I wanted to challenge him, but because I genuinely thought he was joking. I glanced around the table, expecting someone to laugh or say something to smooth it over. No one did. Mark reached for the back of my chair. It happened quickly. The chair shifted, my balance went with it, and suddenly I was on the floor. It was not a violent shove. It was worse than that. It was casual, controlled, enough to make sure I fell without making it look dramatic. The room went silent. I remember the cold shock of the hardwood floor against my palms, the brief sting in my hip. I remember the sound of my own breath as I tried to steady it. What I remember most is what did not happen. No one stood up. No one asked if I was okay. No one told Mark to stop. I looked up and saw faces frozen in place, eyes fixed anywhere but on me. Someone stared at their plate. Someone else pretended to adjust their napkin. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a phone lifted slightly, the screen glowing as it recorded. My mother, Diane, did not look at me. She turned her head toward the kitchen as if something there suddenly needed her attention. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap. I pushed myself up, slowly, carefully. I did not rush. I did not want to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me scramble. My hands were steady when I brushed off my pants. No one offered a hand. No one moved their chair back to make room. Mark had already turned away, laughing at something Lily said, as if nothing had happened at all. In that moment, it became painfully clear that the fall itself was not the point. The message was, I was not welcome. Not really. Not anymore. Maybe I never had been. I sat back down, not because I wanted to, but because leaving right then would have given him what he wanted. I finished my meal in silence, answering questions with short responses, keeping my eyes on my plate. Inside, something shifted. Not anger, not yet. Something colder. As I watched the people around the table, I realized how practiced their silence was. This was not the first time they had looked away. It was just the first time the cruelty was impossible to miss. I thought about all the small moments over the years that had led to this one, the conversations that stopped when I entered a room, the decisions made without my input, the way Lily was always protected, always defended, even when she was wrong, the way I had learned to stay quiet to keep the peace. This was not an accident. It was the final act of a long process of erasure. When dinner ended, chairs scraped against the floor and conversations resumed, careful and polite. No one mentioned what had happened. My mother avoided my eyes, busying herself with dishes that didn't need washing yet. Mark poured himself another drink. I stood up, grabbed my coat, and headed for the door. No one tried to stop me. No one asked where I was going. Outside, the air was cold and sharp. I stood on the porch for a moment, listening to the muffled sound of laughter inside the house. It felt distant, like it belonged to another life. As I walked to my car, I understood something with absolute clarity. They had stayed silent because they believed I always would, because silence had worked before, because it was easier to choose a side. Driving away, I did not cry. I did not yell. My hands were steady on the steering wheel. My thoughts were clear. That night did not raise questions for me. It answered them. And as the house disappeared in my rearview mirror, I knew that whatever came next would not be quiet. Chapter 2. Silence doesn't start in one night. What came next did not start that night, even though it felt like it did. Driving home through quiet streets, I realized the answers had been waiting for years. Long before the chair moved, long before anyone looked away. My father, Robert Whitmore, died in the spring of 2010. He was an engineer by training, methodical, careful, the kind of man who kept every receipt in a folder labeled by year. His death was sudden enough to leave no time for preparation, but not so sudden that he left things unfinished. He had a will, he had a trust. He believed in planning for the future, even when the future felt distant. I was in my mid-20s then, still finding my footing, still grieving in ways I did not yet have words for. My mother, Diane, was older, more fragile in her grief, moving through the days as if each one required effort just to stand upright. The house felt quieter without my father, the silence thick and unfamiliar. Mark entered our lives the following year. It was 2011, and my mother was still wearing grief like a second skin. Mark appeared steady and reassuring, the kind of man who spoke confidently about bills, repairs, and plans. He said all the right things. He talked about stability, about taking care of details so my mother would not have to worry. At first, it felt like relief. Mark offered to help with finances, with paperwork, with phone calls my mother did not want to make. He framed it as kindness, as support. I did not question it then because it did not seem like something to question. My mother smiled more, she slept better. The chaos of loss seemed to quiet. Living in the same house, Lily and I grew up under the same roof, but in very different worlds. Lily was younger, Mark's daughter, bright and confident in the way only someone protected can be. Her needs were always immediate, always valid. When she wanted something, there was discussion, consideration, and eventually a solution. I went to a public university and worked part-time to cover what scholarships did not. I learned to budget early. I learned how to stretch meals and time. Lily tried out ideas, small businesses, creative projects that never lasted long. There was always money to support the next attempt. It was never framed as favoritism. It was framed as investment. Mark liked to say he believed in her. Over time, Mark took on more control. Statements stopped arriving in the mail and moved online. He became the primary contact for banks and service providers. When questions came up, he handled them. My mother told me not to worry, that Mark had it covered. She said she trusted him. I noticed small changes before I noticed big ones. My mother stopped attending community events she once loved. She declined invitations, saying she was tired, saying it was easier to stay home. Conversations about money ended quickly. Any question I asked seemed to make her uncomfortable. I learned to stop asking. In 2020, during a casual conversation in the kitchen, I noticed paperwork on the counter. It was a refinance document for the house. I recognized my mother's signature immediately. She had a distinct way of signing her name, careful and deliberate. I asked about it, not accusing, just curious. My mother waved it off. She said Mark explained it. She said it lowered the interest rate. She told me not to make things complicated. Her voice carried a warning I had not heard before, subtle but firm. I backed down. Looking back, that was the moment something shifted, even if I did not fully understand it then. It was the first time I realized my questions were not welcome, not because they were wrong, but because they threatened the fragile balance my mother was trying to maintain. Mark framed every decision as protection. He talked about shielding my mother from stress. He talked about handling things so she would not have to. Slowly, almost invisibly, he became the gatekeeper to information. My mother let him because saying no would have meant conflict, and conflict felt unbearable after loss. By the time another refinance happened in 2022, I was no longer surprised. I was just uneasy. Lily's spending seemed to increase around the same time, new purchases appearing without explanation. I noticed patterns but did not connect them yet. I told myself I was being suspicious. I told myself families were messy. My mother changed too. She became careful with her words, hesitant to disagree. When Mark spoke, she listened. When he decided, she accepted. The woman who once ran her own life now avoided any situation that might disrupt the calm he promised. That calm was fragile, held together by silence. After the night at the table, those memories surfaced with clarity I could not ignore. I saw how easily my mother had learned to look away, how often she had chosen peace over truth. Her silence was not ignorance, it was fear. Fear of losing stability, fear of being alone again, fear of what would happen if she looked too closely. As I replayed those years in my mind, the pattern became undeniable. The control had been gradual, the silence had been taught, it had been rewarded. Every time my mother avoided a question, things stayed smooth. Every time she spoke up, tension followed. She learned which option felt safer. By the time December 2024 arrived, the system was complete. Everyone knew their role. Mark led, Lily benefited, my mother complied. The rest of the family stayed quiet, and I had learned without ever agreeing to it to take up less space. The push at the table was not a break from the past, it was its conclusion. Sitting alone later that night, I understood something that made my chest feel tight and strangely calm at the same time. If silence had been built over more than a decade, it would not be undone by a single confrontation. Whatever came next would require more than anger. It would require clarity. And clarity, I was starting to realize, was something Mark had never expected me to have. Chapter 3. The moment I stopped reacting. The answers did not arrive all at once. They surfaced quietly, piece by piece, as I drove away from that house and back into a life I suddenly saw with sharper edges. The clarity I felt that night did not come from anger, it came from recognition. I had seen this pattern before. I had just never named it. My father, Robert Whitmore, died in the spring of 2010. He was the kind of man who plans for everything. Even his death, in a way, had been prepared for. He left a will. He set up a trust. He believed stability was something you built, not something you assumed would always be there. I was in my mid-20s then, old enough to understand loss, but not experienced enough to understand how it reshapes people. My mother Diane was different. Her grief was heavier, slower, the kind that settles into your bones. The house felt hollow after he was gone, like every sound echoed a little too long. Mark came into our lives the following year. It was 2011, and my mother was still struggling to regain her footing. Mark presented himself as calm, dependable, practical. He talked about handling bills, fixing things around the house, taking pressure off her shoulders. He framed everything as help. At first, it felt like relief. He took over phone calls with banks. He handled paperwork my mother said she did not have the energy to read. He told her not to worry, that he had experience, that everything was under control. I watched her relax into that idea, watched her hand over responsibility piece by piece. Living under the same roof, Lily and I existed in two very different realities. Lily was younger, Mark's daughter, full of confidence and plans. When she wanted something, it became a discussion. When she failed, it became an opportunity to try again. There was always money for the next idea. I went to a public university. I worked part-time. I learned early how to manage without asking for much. No one ever said this was favoritism. It was explained as encouragement, as belief in Lily's potential. I accepted that explanation because it was easier than challenging it. Over time, Mark's control became quieter. Paper statements disappeared. Everything moved online. He became the primary contact for banks and service providers. When questions came up, he answered them before my mother could. She told me it was easier that way. I noticed changes in her long before I noticed changes in money. She stopped volunteering. She declined invitations she once enjoyed. She avoided conversations that might turn uncomfortable. Whenever I asked about finances, she brushed it off and asked me not to stir things up. I learned to stop asking. In 2020, I remember standing in the kitchen and seeing paperwork spread across the counter, refinance documents for the house. I recognized my mother's signature immediately. It was careful, deliberate, unmistakably hers. I asked about it casually, trying not to sound suspicious. She waved her hand and said Mark had explained everything. She said it lowered the interest rate. She told me not to make things complicated. There was something in her tone that warned me not to push. So I did what I had done for years. I backed off. Another refinance followed in 2022. By then, I felt uneasy but could not articulate why. Around the same time, Lily's spending seemed to increase. New purchases appeared, expensive things that did not match the success of her projects. Mark always had an explanation. Business was good, investments were paying off. My mother changed in ways that were harder to ignore. She deferred to Mark in conversations. She looked to him before answering questions. The woman who once made decisions confidently now avoided disagreements whenever possible. Stability mattered more than truth. After Christmas 2024, those memories replayed themselves with a clarity I could no longer dismiss. The silence at the table made sense in a way it never had before. It was not confusion, it was practice. My mother had learned that asking questions led to tension. Looking too closely risked conflict. Silence kept the peace. Over time, silence became the default. That night was not the beginning of anything new. It was the end of something old. It was the moment when a system built on avoidance finally revealed itself. Sitting alone later, I understood that my mother's silence was not about ignorance. It was about fear. Fear of losing the stability she had rebuilt after my father's death. Fear of being alone again. Fear of what might happen if she admitted how much control she had given away. The pattern was undeniable. Control had been gradual, silence had been rewarded, and every time I stayed quiet, the system grew stronger. By the time that chair moved beneath me, everything was already in place. Mark acted with confidence because he had never been challenged. Lily benefited because no one questioned the flow of money. My mother complied because confrontation felt more dangerous than denial. And I had spent years shrinking myself to fit into a family that no longer made room for me. That realization did not make me angry, it made me calm. If the silence had been built over more than a decade, it would not be undone by one emotional moment. Whatever came next would require precision. It would require restraint. It would require seeing the situation not as a daughter desperate to be heard, but as someone finally willing to look at the truth without looking away. That was when I understood what Mark had never expected from me: clarity. Chapter 4: When Control Slipped. That clarity became action the moment I stopped treating what I knew as something personal and started treating it as something procedural. I did not confront Mark. I did not warn anyone. I did not ask for permission. I did what I had been trained to do for years and sent the information through the channel designed to handle exactly this kind of thing. It was quiet at first. No sirens, no angry calls, just a confirmation email acknowledging receipt and a promise that the matter would be reviewed. That was all I needed. Once the process started, it did not require my voice to stay loud. Within days, a request for verification went out. The bank needed additional documentation related to the refinance history. Standard language, neutral tone, enough to make anyone paying attention feel a shift in the air. Mark called a family meeting almost immediately. He framed it as proactive, as responsible. "It's just a routine check," he said, standing in the living room like he always did when he wanted to sound in control. "These things happen. Banks review files all the time." No one argued with him, not at first. Paul Harlan was the first crack I noticed. He sat stiffly on the couch, eyes darting between Mark and the floor. Paul had worked in real estate long enough to know what routine looked like, and this was not it. He asked a few careful questions about timelines and paperwork. Mark brushed them aside, his voice a little sharper than usual. "Everything's fine," Mark said. "You worry too much." Paul did not look reassured. Over the next week, calls came in, not dramatic ones, quiet ones. Partners asking for clarification, lenders requesting documents that should have already been on file. Each request alone meant nothing. Together, they formed pressure. Some relatives stopped returning my messages. Others avoided me entirely. I could feel the shift when I walked into a room, the unspoken calculation. If something went wrong, no one wanted to be standing too close. My mother felt it too. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I was not there when it came, but I knew the moment she opened it. She called me an hour later, her voice tight, controlled in the way it got when she was trying not to panic. "Elena," she said, "I need you to come over." I drove to the house and found her sitting at the kitchen table with the letter spread out in front of her. She looked smaller than I remembered, shoulders drawn in, hands folded together like she was bracing herself. "They're asking me to verify the loan terms," she said. "They want documentation, dates. I don't understand." I sat across from her and looked at the paper. The numbers were clear. The language was careful. There was nothing vague about it anymore. She looked up at me, eyes searching my face. "How long have you known about this?" I did not answer right away. I chose my words the same way I had chosen every step until now. Long enough to know that staying quiet wasn't protecting you. It was protecting him. Her mouth trembled. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" "I tried," I said, keeping my voice even. "Every time I asked a question, you told me not to make things complicated." She closed her eyes. For a long moment, the house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Mark came in while we were still sitting there. He took one look at the letter and then at me, and something flickered in his expression. Not anger, not yet. Something closer to surprise. "What's going on?" he asked. Diane did not answer him. She was still looking at me. "You did this," Mark said, his tone flat. "You went behind my back." I followed a process. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't make a scene. I let the system ask the questions. His jaw tightened. "You had no right." "I had every right," I replied. "It's my family, and it's her name on those documents." For the first time since I had known him, Mark did not immediately have a response. Word spread quickly after that, not through gossip, but through absence. Invitations stopped coming. People stopped calling Mark for advice. At the grocery store, Emily Carter from down the street caught my eye and hesitated before approaching. "I heard things are complicated right now. I hope your mom is okay." I thanked her and kept walking, aware of the way Mark's presence in the neighborhood had shifted from authority to curiosity. Inside the house, tension replaced routine. Mark paced more. He talked louder. He made calls behind closed doors. Diane started opening mail herself, reading every page before handing it over. The control he had exercised so smoothly for years was slipping, not because I pushed it away, but because the system no longer deferred to him. Another notice arrived, then another. Each one narrowed the space he had to maneuver. Paul called me one evening, his voice low. I didn't know everything, but I knew enough to be worried. "I'm not asking you to take sides. I'm asking you to be honest." He sighed. "That might be harder than taking sides." The breaking point came quietly. No shouting, no dramatic reveal, just a moment when Mark realized the questions were not going away. "They're asking for records I don't have," he admitted to Diane, his voice tight. "This is getting out of hand." Diane looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in her posture changed. "This is my name, my house, my signature. You said you handled everything." "I did," he snapped. "I was trying to protect you." "From what?" she asked. He did not answer. I watched from the doorway as the truth settled in, not all at once, slowly, heavier with each breath. Mark did not lose control because I confronted him. He lost it because the structure he relied on stopped responding to his authority. The process didn't care about his explanations or his confidence. It only cared about documentation. By the end of the week, the house felt unfamiliar. Lines had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. Diane moved through the rooms with a new awareness, opening drawers, checking files, asking questions she had avoided for years. Mark stopped pretending everything was normal. I did not feel victorious. I felt steady. The dominoes were falling not because I pushed them, but because they had been standing too close together for too long. The family fractured quietly. Sides formed without being announced. Diane sat with the letter again that night, reading it slowly, and for the first time, she did not look away. Mark stood in the hallway, his confidence gone, replaced with something brittle and uncertain. That's when I understood the real cost of silence, not just what it allowed to happen, but how much control it gave to the wrong person. And once that control slipped, there was no way to put it back where it had been. Chapter 5. What Silence Costs. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. Not peaceful, not calm, just subdued, as if everyone involved was waiting for something invisible to finish moving into place. I did not have to push or follow up or remind anyone that the process had started. Once it did, it moved with a rhythm of its own. The audit took weeks. Not dramatic weeks filled with confrontation or raised voices, but slow ones, measured by emails, document requests, and scheduled calls. Everything was handled through attorneys and compliance officers who had no interest in family dynamics. They cared about records, signatures, timelines, and consistency. They cared about what could be proven. Mark tried at first to stay involved, to steer conversations, to explain away discrepancies. That approach lasted until it became clear that explanations without documentation carried no weight. Meetings happened without him. Requests were addressed directly to my mother. The center of gravity shifted in ways he could not control. When the settlement was finalized, there was no announcement, no spectacle. A civil agreement approved by the court placed the assets under temporary management. Mark was required to step away from operational control. It was precise and restrained, the kind of outcome that felt almost anticlimactic if you expected punishment to be loud. It was not loud. It was final. The house felt different after that. The tension that had once hummed beneath every conversation was replaced by something heavier, a quiet reckoning. Diane moved through the rooms with a new attentiveness, opening drawers, reviewing paperwork, asking questions she had avoided for years. One afternoon, she sat across from me at the same kitchen table where the letter had first been opened. There were no raised voices, no accusations. "I thought I was choosing stability," she said. "I didn't see how much it was costing you." She did not ask for forgiveness. She did not offer excuses. She simply named the choice she had made. It was the closest she had come to honesty in a long time. I nodded, because that was all there was to say. Some realizations arrived too late to fix what they broke. Mark packed his things quietly. There were no arguments when he left, just the sound of doors closing and the absence that followed. His authority disappeared almost overnight. Calls went unanswered, invitations stopped coming. The confidence that had once filled every room no longer had anywhere to land. I returned to work and found that my life there had remained intact. My reputation had held. The careful boundaries I had maintained mattered. Facts had done what emotions never could. I was still trusted, still steady, still standing in a space I had earned. There was no moment of triumph, no urge to celebrate. The satisfaction I felt was quieter than that, rooted in the knowledge that I had not compromised myself to be heard. I did not go back to that dining table, not to reclaim a seat or prove a point. I did not need to. The house no longer felt like home, and that realization came without bitterness. Leaving was not a loss, it was a decision. In the weeks that followed, family gatherings happened without me, smaller and more subdued. Some people reached out, awkwardly, unsure of what to say. Others stayed silent, perhaps unsure where they stood now that the old hierarchy had collapsed. I watched from a distance, no longer invested in managing their comfort. What stayed with me most was how ordinary the end felt. Silence had allowed everything to grow unchecked for years, and when it finally broke, it did not do so in a single dramatic moment. It fractured quietly, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to hold it together. That is the part people rarely talk about. Silence does not protect, it delays, and the longer it delays, the more expensive the truth becomes. I did not get justice in the way movies portray it. There were no apologies that erased the past, no moment where everything made sense again. What I got instead was something sturdier, resolution, clarity, the ability to move forward without carrying someone else's secrets. I still think about that night sometimes, about how the chair sliding back and the room going still. I think about how many people chose comfort over courage in that moment, and I think about how easily I could have done the same. Silence is a choice. It always is, and every choice carries a cost, even when it feels easier in the moment. If you have ever found yourself watching something wrong happen and felt the pull to look away, to keep the peace, to tell yourself it was not your place, I want to know what you would do now. Would you stay quiet, or would you speak up, even when the truth risks changing everything?